The amazing part about it is the media is not only letting the Biden administration get away with it, but they're actually perpetuating the lie themselves. I mean, the media doesn't want to call this a recession. Of course, if Trump were president, that's all they'd be talking about is the Trump recession. And there's no way they'd let him wiggle out of it by trying to claim that it's not a recession, that 2 declining quarters of GDP isn't the definition of recession, when that is exactly the definition of recession. Now they're trying to claim, well, recession is when you have a broad-based decline in the economy. Well, that's exactly what we've got. I mean, I've never really seen a decline more broad-based than the one we've got now. So I don't know why it doesn't qualify for a recession based on that criteria. Of course, the Democrats and the Biden administration, they're pointing to the unemployment rate, and they're saying, oh my God, you can't be in recession with 3.6% unemployment. Well, who said? I mean, certainly you can be at a low unemployment rate early in the recession. I think we're early. I think the recession is going to be with us for many more quarters. In fact, probably for several years. And so the unemployment rate's going to get a lot higher. But meanwhile, the unemployment rate, the official rate, is understating the number of people who don't have jobs. And of course, a lot of the jobs that are being created, they're pointing to all these new jobs being created. But a lot of these jobs are second jobs and third jobs. It's because workers are getting such big pay cuts as a result of inflation that one job isn't enough anymore. People need 2 and 3 jobs to pay the bills. And again, that's not the sign of a strong labor market. They're claiming we've got this really strong labor market. Well, if we had a strong labor market, you wouldn't need 3 jobs. One would do just fine. And in fact, if we really had a strong labor market, workers would be getting raises. That really is what defines a strong labor market. You've got so much demand for labor that workers can go to their bosses and demand a raise. And a raise is where your pay goes up more than the cost of living. So if inflation is 5%, you get a 10% raise. What's happening now is inflation is 9% and people are getting a 4 or 5% raise. That's a 5% pay cut. So if you have a job market where workers are forced to accept pay cuts, that's a weak labor market. And that's what we've got. We've got inflation, we've got recession, and we've got a weak labor market. It's a trifecta of economic misery. In fact, look at the savings rate. The savings rate is at the lowest since the Great Recession of 2008. Household debt just hit an all-time record high, about 16.15 trillion. It's up 2 trillion since the pandemic. Meanwhile, the national debt is up 8 trillion since the pandemic. So households are on the hook for that. Credit card debt year over year just had its biggest rise in 20 years because people can't make ends meet with their diminished paychecks. So they're having to use their credit card to buy food, to buy gas. That's what's going on. So all the signs point to recession, except the Democrats want to ignore those signs and pretend that an economy in recession is actually a strong economy that's still growing. Yeah, they weren't just saying the economy was fine. They were saying it was great. It was super strong. It was like the strongest ever. Meanwhile, it was in recession. We've been in recession all year. Now, the reason that I knew back in 2021 that the recession was going to start in the first half of 2022 was because I could see the toll that inflation was taking on consumers. Prices were rising, and so real spending was going to have to fall. And I knew that that would have adverse effects on an economy built around consumer spending. See, I also knew that inflation was here to stay. Back in 2021, the standard view was that, oh, it's transitory, don't worry about it. So the Fed was wrong on both inflation and the economy. They thought inflation was not as strong as it was, and they thought the economy was stronger than it was. So they got inflation wrong. They underestimated the strength of inflation. They overestimated the strength of the economy. But I knew that inflation would be a problem, and I also knew the rate hikes would be a problem. We have a highly levered economy, and that higher interest rates would just be another blow to households that are already struggling with higher food prices, higher gas prices. And I also knew the impact that rising mortgage rates would have on the housing market, the auto market. And so to me, a recession in the first half was obvious. And all the people that were claiming the economy was so strong, now they're pretending it's not in recession when it is. So, I mean, I've never seen anything like this. And I have no idea, when they're going to admit it. They've even got the Federal Reserve reading from this playbook, claiming that we're not in recession, and still holding on to hope that they can somehow guide the economy to a soft landing when it's already crashed. They use this made-up number that nobody pays, and according to the government, that's only up 5.5%, and that's 1/3 of the CPI. Well, we should use home prices or actual rents as 1/3 of the CPI, not this made-up number. But the problem with the housing market is the cost of building new homes has risen so much because of higher material costs, higher labor costs, and the price or the cost to buy those homes is much higher because mortgage rates have basically doubled from around 3% to 6%. So first-time homes are pretty much unaffordable now for anybody at the current price level, which means they're stuck as renters, which gives the landlords the ability to really jack up their rents because they don't have to worry about their tenants buying a place because they can't afford it. Meanwhile, there is a shortage of homes for sale because the people who own homes, they don't want to sell because they've got a 3% mortgage, 3.5% mortgage. They can't replicate that. The only way to keep that cheap money is to keep the house. So the people who have houses, the last thing they want to do is sell, and the people who don't have them can't afford to buy. So now you have a terrible housing market. And what's really going to happen is new construction is going to stop because nobody can afford to buy a new construction. So the whole home building industry collapses, and there go all the jobs associated with that. But when you have this diminished turnover, because even the existing homes don't sell because the new buyers can't afford them, and the current owners don't want to sell them, you don't have the turnover. So you don't have the real estate agents, you don't have, remodeling, redecorating, the movers. I mean, so a lot of economic activity goes away when nobody is buying and selling homes. And what these politicians are worried about is the next election. And so if the voters are asked to swallow this bitter-tasting medicine, they're not going to like it. And so they're not going to reelect the people that made them swallow it. So nobody wants to do it. But, it's unfortunate, but this bubble has to pop. The sooner the better. The problem is we've had cheap money for so long. The bubble is so big. We've made so many mistakes, so many misallocations of resources and malinvestments. There's a lot that needs to be unwound. A lot of companies that never should have been started need to go bankrupt. A lot of jobs that never should have been created need to be lost. Workers are misallocated. They're not doing the right thing. Look at our massive trade deficits of $80 billion a month. What does that tell you? We're not making enough stuff because too many of our people are employed doing the wrong things. They're in companies that only exist because of 0% interest rates or quantitative easing. Meanwhile, we're not doing the things that we need to do, and we're going into debt to buy the things that we're not making because of these misallocations in the economy. People haven't been saving enough. They're bending too much. All these patterns have to change, and they will change if the Fed allows interest rates to return to a free market level. But when that happens, again, bankruptcies, defaults, losses, everybody has to cut back, including the U.S. government. One of the things that the Fed has been financing is a massive growth in government spending. I mentioned the national debt is up $8 trillion since the pandemic. Who made that possible? The Fed, with its monetary policy. So if the Fed actually reverses course to fight the inflation it created, that's going to force the government to dramatically cut government spending. But they're not doing that right now. They keep increasing government spending. And so we're not doing any of the things that we need to do to fight inflation. Now, what the Fed is doing will let some of the air out of the bubble. So we're in recession already. The recession is going to get worse. Unemployment is going to pick up. But before it gets too bad, or maybe even after, it depends on how long they wait to pivot, and maybe there'll be another Lehman-type blow-up, that creates a crisis, the Fed is going to surrender in its war on inflation. And it's going to fight a new war against a recession and financial crisis. And that means inflation is going to win. The Fed's going to surrender. It's not going to be like Paul Volcker, who was victorious. Powell's battle is he's going to end in defeat. And the problem is, when the Fed tries to stimulate the economy, when inflation is already well above 2%, and it sends inflation into the double digits, the markets are no longer going to have any confidence in the Fed. When the balance sheet explodes above 9 trillion, then through 10 trillion and to infinity and beyond, the markets are no longer going to believe anything the Fed says about its resolve and its commitment. Inflation is going to be seen as here to stay, and it's going to be very high. And that's going to be a game changer, because the bottom will drop out of the dollar, long-term interest rates are going to soar, and the price of gold and silver are going to go through the roof.